Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law, I'd like to welcome you all to our 5th European Animal Rights Law Conference. My name is Raffael Fasel. I am an assistant professor in the law faculty here in Cambridge, a fellow of Jesus, and together with Sean Butler, who's briefly disappeared, I'm the co-director of the Cambridge Centre. Now, some of you will recognize themselves in this picture here. And if you do, that's because you were at our last conference in 2023, which took place just in a different college here in Cambridge. Now, as some of you may recall, that conference was on the theme of animal rights in litigation. And that conference featured leading judges from around the world, depicted on the slide here, mostly on the left side, I think, here. And it brought them into conversation with pioneering animal rights scholars and practitioners. Our 2023 conference focused on this revolutionary theme of litigation that animal lawyers have brought to have animals recognized as legal persons or as holders of fundamental legal rights. But already at the time, we were quite conscious of the fact that, of course, there are also many efforts that animal advocates have undertaken to secure animal rights in that other great forum of law, and that's legislatures. So it therefore seemed quite natural to us to organize this year's conference on the complementary theme of animal rights in legislation. And focusing on animal rights in legislation, we think is particularly timely because it has emerged as a really promising route to animal rights. As many of you will be aware, several courts who are faced with animal rights litigation, they have expressed some concerns over what they see as sort of overreaching, right? They think they would overreach if they granted rights to animals, and they said, no, this is really a job for parliaments, for the legislature. Certainly this has happened in the US, but also in some other countries. Now, I'll say more in a minute about why I think analyzing animal rights legislation is really so interesting today. But before I do so, I want to express thanks to some people and organizations without whom we wouldn't be here today. So first of all, I'd like to thank our center's donors for their generous financial support. We're very grateful to the Jeremy Coller Foundation and to the International Society for Animal Rights, as well as our other donors. I'd also like to express my gratitude to our wonderful team who have made this event possible. Carlina Leiva Ilabaka, where is she? Up there, she's raising her hand, up there. So she's the person who's made all of this possible. She's worked tirelessly to secure an amazing group of speakers, a lovely venue, the food, accommodation for those who've booked it as well. Then we've got Carly McCann up there. She's our social media and PR expert. If you've come across this conference, it's because she was doing all this amazing marketing. That's why you're sitting here, really. And Carly will also be recording the presentations and the discussions, and she'll be taking some photos as well throughout the event. So if you wouldn't like your picture taken, please speak to Carly. Then we've got Ava Burnett Kempers. Where's Ava? Right here, Ava. So she's put together the lovely conference brochure that everyone should have in their merch bags. Then further, a big thanks to all of our wonderful speakers and our two keynote speakers, Dr. Visa Kirkis, who's already here up there, and Saskia Stucki, who's going to be joining us tomorrow. They're here to share their experience with us, and we're really grateful for that. And then last but not least, thanks to you all, the delegates, for making your way to Cambridge and for being willing to learn more about this really fascinating topic. Just for you, we made sure that we have typical British weather, so I hope you're enjoying that. So, animal rights in legislation. Why focus an entire conference on animal rights in legislation? When Sean Butler and I wrote our textbook here, Animal Rights Law, we included a chapter on animal rights in legislation. And in the introduction of that chapter, we actually wrote that really currently there is no proper piece of animal rights legislation yet. And the book came out in 2023. But we added that future editions of the textbook might change and have, legislation included in that chapter that actually, has been passed. Of course, the chapter talks about proposals, but no legislation had actually been passed yet. But our prophecy materialized, because since we wrote the book, there have been groundbreaking developments in animal rights legislation. In particular, animal rights legislation was introduced in Panama and Oja in California to protect the rights of turtles and elephants, respectively. In this conference here, we're going to have the really great honor, I think, of hearing firsthand from the people who have initiated those laws. Now, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the swift expansion of animal rights legislation that we have seen in recent years. But this wouldn't be a Cambridge conference if I didn't briefly define the key terms. So let me do that. So what do I mean exactly by animal rights legislation? Now, there's, of course, plenty of animal welfare legislation out there. Indeed, as the textbook explains, 79% of all countries had some form of animal protection law in 2021. That's when we gathered all the data. So 79% of all countries had some form of animal protection law. Does this mean that the developments in Panama and Oja are just more of the same and that you're attending a conference perhaps like any other? No, it doesn't. Because to understand the difference, I propose to distinguish here between thin rights legislation and thick rights legislation. The 79% just mentioned have thin rights legislation. This means that there are countries that have maybe anti-cruelty laws or more positive animal welfare laws that impose duties on humans, for instance, not to do certain things with animals, or even to provide them with, certain other things, maybe, enough space to roam around. And that legislation can be understood as giving thin rights to animals. And while that's really important in its own right, it doesn't quite give animals thick rights. So what's a thick right then? This is the definition we give in the textbook. And as this definition shows, we take a thick right to have 5 characteristic elements. So I'm gonna focus on 4 of them here. I'm gonna skip the first one. I'm gonna use the right to bodily integrity as an example to illustrate those 4 points, to make it a bit more concrete. So the right to bodily integrity protects the fundamental interest that individuals have in their bodily integrity, and it does so in a comprehensive way, rather than simply protecting an individual from harm in very specific circumstances only, maybe in experimentation or in slaughter, right? So it's much more comprehensive. Then, the right to bodily integrity cannot easily be overridden by trivial countervailing human interests. Perhaps, people's interest in exploiting the body of the rights holder for their own purposes. Then, moving down to number 4 here, the right to bodily integrity entails standing, so it allows the holder of or their representatives to enforce violations of the right in court. And finally here, number 5, the right to bodily integrity is interpreted dynamically, or can be interpreted dynamically by relevant legal officials, usually courts, to enhance the protection of that right over time. So that's what happened to most human rights, really. They've had their protection enhanced over time. Now, I want to be clear that these features here are ideal elements, right? Ideal, in the sense that you get a sort of paradigmatic or a perfect thick right if you have all these elements and if they're met to the full extent. So when we're faced with a concrete piece of legislation, the question we need to ask is, well, how many of these elements does this legislation have? And to what extent does it have them, right? So in that sense, it's ideal. Now, as we will see, most and maybe all of the pieces of animal rights legislation that exist today lack some of these elements, or they have them to a sort of lesser extent than we might like. So we are really only at the start here of a journey. But the pieces of legislation that we're going to be discussing over the next 2.5 days are still very different from the more simple pieces of thin welfare legislation that I mentioned earlier, because the pieces of legislation that we're going to be discussing have, we think, a sufficient number of these elements, or they have them to a sufficient degree to show that they are a form of legislation that is different, that is trying to do something different, namely they're sort of going towards thick legislation, going towards meeting all those criteria, perhaps at some point. Now, here are some of the examples of the form that thick rights legislation can take. The first and most obvious one is a Bill of Rights, right? Like we know it from the US Constitution, sort of an extensive fundamental rights catalog. A Bill of Rights of this sort would protect many animals at the same time and give them a whole range of different rights. But then there's also a different form of legislation, a more piecemeal form of legislation, more focused, that maybe only gives specific rights to specific animals, right? So that's another sort of shape that we can envisage for animal rights legislation, and indeed that we already seen the examples of OJA and Panama that we're going to look at. And then thirdly, I think it's also possible that there's legislation, thick rights legislation, that bans specific uses of animals and that counts as giving rights to animals in this thick sense. So I have an example here that I'm going to talk about in a second, but the idea here is a simple one. I don't think a piece of legislation needs to say rights for it to meet the 5 elements that we just listed before, right? So that's the idea here. So, take an example from the human rights context. There's the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading degrading treatment or punishment. So that's usually sort of seen as giving a right to humans not to be tortured. But if you look at it, it's not actually framed in rights language. What it says, rather, is that states have obligations to take effective measures to prevent acts of torture, right? So it's a ban of torture, and it's a sort of requirement on states to take measures. It doesn't actually say humans have a right not to be tortured. So that's why I think bans can be thick rights legislation too, as long as they are sufficiently widely conceived, I think, and meet a sufficient number of the thick rights element that we just saw on the slide here. Now, as promised, I wanted to give you a brief overview of the accelerating pace of recent developments in animal rights legislation. And as this graph here makes clear, I focused only on national pieces of legislation, both constitutional, primary legislation as well as secondary legislation or regulations. I didn't include here the quite many international proposals for declarations of rights, for instance, that exist. Our textbook looks at them if you're interested, but I didn't include them here. The picture that emerges is one of a rather rapid acceleration of thick rights legislation. The first notable thick rights proposal here came about no earlier than 2008. And this was the Great Ape Project's proposal for a right to life and the right to freedom for great apes, which the Spanish Parliament considered, but unlike some media reports, didn't actually enact. Then we see an uptick of proposals between 2010 and 2020. So proposals are the ones in the darker font, and then we'll see the past ones in the lighter blue in a minute. So this uptick saw proposals for great ape rights in Germany, primate rights, constitutional primate rights being voted on in the canton of Basel-Stadt in Switzerland, and the first proper Bill of Rights for animals being proposed by the Finnish Animal Rights Law Society, and we have representatives of that society here to talk to us about the proposal later in this conference. Then in 2019, the breakthrough, the first thick rights legislation was not only proposed but also passed. And that's because in 2019, the Canadian Parliament enacted it's called the Ending the Captivity of Whales and Dolphins Act. This act makes it a criminal offense to have cetaceans in captivity, to breed them, and to move cetaceans in the wild from their immediate vicinity. Now this, I've come to actually realize, is a thick ban and gives animals thick rights. We didn't include it in the textbook at the time. We didn't really consider this idea of bans as rights, so that's why the textbook doesn't include it. But I think it should probably be seen as giving rights to animals, because it effectively amounts to giving the right to liberty to cetaceans, I think. And that becomes clear once we apply the 4 criteria that I mentioned before. So skipping the first one again. Canada's ban provides wide protection for cetaceans' fundamental interest in liberty and in not being forcibly bred. So we have quite a comprehensive protection of liberty, not a very narrow one, of a fundamental interest. At least part of the ban is contained in Canada's criminal code, and that to me suggests it's an absolute prohibition, right? And therefore cannot be traded off easily against trivial human interests, so it meets that condition as well. Condition 3 on the list. Now, the law doesn't give standing to animals, it's true, but Canada, as far as I know, does allow for a private prosecution to be brought by citizens, so potentially that provides a means of better protecting the ban, but I grant that it doesn't meet the criterion fully here. Now, and again, it's a bit too soon for us to tell how dynamically the courts will interpret this ban, but it's certainly possible that a dynamic interpretation might happen, not least because parts of this legislation also amended laws other than the criminal code that might be a bit more open to dynamic interpretation, because criminal codes aren't usually interpreted dynamically for quite good reasons. Then moving to 2023, the city of Oja in California amended its municipal code to recognize rights for elephants, specifically the right to bodily liberty. In 2024, just 1 year later, we have turtles' rights in Panama. So the Parliament of Panama enacted a law called the Law Number 371, which requires the state to ensure that the rights of sea turtles and their habitats are protected. Now, it's possible that there are more examples of thick rights legislation out there that you know about, and I certainly look very much forward to listening to all the presentations and perhaps, sort of completing this graph at some point. But what we can definitely say, I think, is that since the start of the new millennium, there has been a very exciting new trend toward proposing and now also passing thick rights legislation for animals. And really, what better way to study this legislation than to listen to the people who've actually sort of shepherded the legislation, through legislatures or who have proposed, these laws. And I'm very excited that this conference is doing just that. It has brought together the world's leading academics on this topic, political representatives, lawyers, governmental officials, all of whom I think are committed to making thick rights legislation for animals a reality. I don't know you, but I certainly can't wait to hear from all of them. But before we do that, we're going to just listen to Sean talk us through the practicalities of this event as well. So, Sean, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.